Blessings, good evening to you all. Tuesday night, which means Q&A session. And we have a few questions tonight. The first is a request to hear something about the life and teachings of Venerable Luang Tui. Luang Tui, for those of you who've been around a while, visited our monastery a couple of times in the early years. So maybe 16, 18, 19 years ago, 20 years ago even. He's a very well, highly respected forest monk who lives in northeast Thailand, who now must be around 87 years old. But that's a guess. He may be slightly less, or probably slightly more. But still in reasonable good health. He's always been quite physically energetic, fairly skinny, and kind of often seems to be quite full of energy for his age. Certainly he can talk well about the Dhamma and give very good instructions. And he's renowned for his strict discipline. He has at his monastery the strict adherence to the Vinaya, the monk's rules, and the simplicity of the lifestyle of himself and his monks is well known. He ordained as a novice, I think probably just after Luang Man died. I'm not sure that he's old enough to have met Luang Man. But ordaining as a novice, that may be something like 70 years ago, so a long time ago. And after being a novice for a few years, he became a monk. He's from northeast Thailand, so if you look at a map of northeast Thailand, way up in the northeast corner, he's from Sakonnakhon province, but now lives in what is known as Bungan province, used to be Nong Khai, so it's where the Mekong River forms a corner with Laos, and his monastery is called Wat Ba Dan Wewek, means like the secluded place of seclusion. And it certainly is a secluded place. When I was a young monk, I went to live there for a while as a break when I was spending a lot of time attending to Luang Cha because he was ill. I spent quite a bit of my earlier years helping to nurse and just look after him. But sometimes I'd go off for a break, for a quiet period of time, and that was when I went to stay with Luang Tui. So I've known him for many years, and then later he came to visit us here. And he spent a lot of time with Luang Khao, who was one of Luang Man's well-known senior disciples. And he did spend time with other monks, notably Luang Mahabua, another very well-respected senior monk. And he did spend time wandering around the forests of Thailand, particularly northeast Thailand, his sort of home territory. I remember one time giving a foot massage to Luang Mahabua, and he was telling me about how much fun he had going on Tudong, walking together through the forests with Luang Tui as young monks. And he said, they sometimes just walk in silence for many hours, the way you do on those walking tours, wandering from mountain to mountain, forest to forest. But he said occasionally there'd be a few interesting incidents, and he said one thing, for a bit of it, you might say, monk entertainment. Luang Por Tui had a great love of animals, so they're walking through the forest. Luang Por Tui could imitate a forest chicken very well. So sometimes for a bit of fun, he would just make the call of a forest chicken, and out of the forest, genuine wild forest chickens would come out, attracted by this call. And they'd have a bit of a laugh about that and carry on walking. And Luang Tar Mahabua always praised Luang Por Tui as very strict and dedicated to the practice of Dhamma Vinaya, with his heart intent on attaining Nibbana. So Luang Tar Mahabua himself was revered as a great enlightened meditation master. So to receive that praise was always considered sort of a kind of confirmation that Luang Por Tui himself must be a very well practiced monk. And Luang Tar Mahabua used to visit his monastery regularly. He liked the peace and quiet of the monastery, and they'd chat about the Dhamma. So I occasionally had the opportunity to sit and listen to the two of them talk about Dhamma. Whenever Luang Por Tui met Ajahn Mahabua, Luang Por Tui was a few years junior, and he'd just get down in the dirt and bow to Luang Tar Mahabua as soon as he met him. Very humble. Whereas in his own monastery, he'd always have a number of monks there, maybe 20 monks or so, were living with him. He was like the army general. He definitely had a army general side to him. Great sense of authority. Even though he was a very slight, short, skinny figure, he had a very big presence, and certainly could get things done, good at ordering the monks around to get the chores done, get things cleaned up, and do things well in his monastery. And he lives very simply, still to this day. His monastery, Wat Down Riway, came about in the mid-1960s, when he was still wandering. And in that part of Thailand, Nong Khai Bungan, this top corner, actually in those times it was the Vietnam-Laotian Communist War, and that part of Thailand was considered pretty much communist, even though it was still within Thailand. It was sort of in a semi-state of war because of the influence of the wars around from the other side of the Mekong River. So it was actually quite a dangerous place for monks to go wandering, but Luang Por Tui has always been known as fearless, compassionate but fearless. And so he did go wandering there in that area because they wanted good monks to teach, because there were still a lot of Buddhists in that area. And I remember when he was staying with us, he said before he started his monastery, he was wandering and camping in that area, and he was actually almost caught up in a plot, because they say some of the communists wanted to get rid of monks because they were obviously a-religious and they didn't like the respect and the influence monks had amongst the villagers, so they tried to knock a few of them off, and they succeeded. There was one cave where they managed to lure a wandering monk there and killed him. And the same people, we believe, Luang Por Tui said, they tried to lure him to the same cave with the same plan, but he was a bit sharper and didn't fall for it, so he avoided those people in that cave. And that's his character. He's always been one who's very sharp towards people, knowing their intention, knowing where they're at, whether you can trust them or not. He's always skeptical and suspicious of people if they're not, keeping precepts, practicing the Dhamma. He's very sharp on knowing people and where they're at in their mind. So he managed to keep himself out of that danger. And eventually he was invited by the villagers of the village Sang Arun, the village of the light of dawn, is where he lives now. They invited him to stay, and he Started practicing in the forest on this rocky hilltop. So since the 1960s he's lived there, very simply, but a beautiful forest with a mixture of rocky outcrops and big old forest trees, which are quite hard to find in Thailand now. And he's preserved the forest, and now there's about at least 1,000 acres of forest which he's preserved, he says, for future generations. And he had to build a wall around this forest because they were having problems with people hunting the animals, because there's still a lot of wild animals there. And some of the wild animals, like the wild pigs, would go out and disturb the villagers, eat their crops and things. So there was a bit of problems. So he built a wall around this huge area of forest to preserve it, preserve the animals. And he has a lot of compassion for forest animals and a desire to preserve trees. Great foresight. He would be talking about global warming, climate change, the loss of the world's resources. 40, 50 years ago he was already thinking in that way. So he's preserved this big forest area, he says, for future generations. And when I went to stay there as a young monk, he was setting up a project where the whole of his monastery he was offering to the King of Thailand. And he did a legal document. He had a team of lawyers who came to visit him, and they got the plan of the area, and they made a legal document giving the monastery to the king for in perpetuity, they say. So no one can ever log it, destroy it. And he said one of the things that prompted this was that during that period, because of the Vietnam and Laotian War, and there was a lot of US activity, US Air Force activity and so on there, one of their satellites found what they thought was gold underneath the rock, underneath his monastery. And so he made this legal document and said, nobody's going to get this gold. Put it in nice legal terms. Nobody's going to get this gold, certainly not anyone from another country. No one's going to dig up this mountain, remove the trees to get gold. The only person who has the rights over this place is the King of Thailand. And he made it all very legal and a well-produced document for the future, to preserve the forest. And he built a chedi there, a stupa, to house Buddha relics and various religious artifacts. And one of them was he had a set of the Buddhist Tripitaka written on the best quality paper that you can get in the world, he said at the time, that had a lifespan of 1,000 years. So he said to preserve the Buddhist teachings, he had them stored in these time capsules inside the stupa, the chedi, for future generations again. And he's made a Dhamma garden where he's had engraved on granite teachings from all the leading enlightened forest masters of the Ajahn Man lineage, as well as teachings of the Buddha. And they're there, and they all last a long time because it's teachings engraved in granite, stone. So that's his character. He's very firm in his commitment to the practice of Dhamma Vinaya for Nibbana, and you get that when you go to live with him. When I was living with him, the monks called him, they'd say, he's like your mother and father all in one. He can be very soft and supportive and gentle and looks after you and makes sure you're okay, but he's also very stern and strict in the discipline. So it's kind of a mixture. So sometimes you couldn't be sure what you would get. Sometimes it'd be the strict side, sometimes it'd be the soft side. He had a great sense of humour, so he also could laugh, have a good laugh. And he's very interested in learning about the world, especially from foreign monks. He'd have lots of conversations about the way of the world, because where he lived, a very quiet corner of rural Thailand, out of the way. But he had a good understanding of geopolitics and technology and the ways of the world. He's always interested to learn. But at the same time, he likes to keep his monastery simple. So there's no electricity there, no running water, although I believe there may be a little bit more now, maybe in the area for the laity. But traditionally and historically, he hasn't had running water or electricity. You go and stay there, like when I stayed there, I'd either bathe in a pond, you have a bucket, you'd bring water out and soap up and wash yourself just with pond water, sitting next to a pond or in a pond. You go into the pond first and come out and then bathe. Or a well just dug in the ground, getting groundwater up with a bucket, and you throw the water over yourself. So there's no showers, no hot water, no running water. So you're basically bathing with the animals, because there's a lot of deer and wild boar and birds and porcupines and other things there. They use the same water. So every day we'd have to do chores to collect water from the wells and use push carts to take them around, say to the kitchen, the toilets and the places where water was needed. No piped water. Everyone used candles, so if you lived there, every 2 weeks you'd get one box of candles, and that had to last you for 2 weeks. So you've learned to be very conservative with your candle use, just enough to get by at night. And if you had good moonlight and you're doing walking meditation, you just walk by the moonlight. And you walk meditation at his monastery, you'd get a lot of animals coming by. It was quite a busy forest. Even one time, a tiger, a proper tiger, came into the monastery. They say it swam the river, the Mekong River, from the more lush forest on the Laos side and came to Luang Por Thui's monastery, attracted by the forest and the animals in the forest. So when I was there one day, one of the new monks was just walking from his kuti to the main hall, which he would do at dawn. And some of the huts, the kutis, were maybe 500 meters or even a kilometer away. It's such a big forest. So walking towards the hall with his bowl ready to go on alms round into the village, this monk came across a tiger sitting on a rock next to the path, growling at him, which he said woke him up. And he rushed off to tell everyone else there's a tiger in the monastery. But luckily the tiger only lasted a few days and then it moved on. But it certainly gave some excitement for a while. Another pet of Ajahn Chua, Luang Por Thui in the early days would keep a few pets. He'd have, well, not pets, but just animals that were hanging around the monastery. He'd feed them, look after them like pets. So there was peacocks, various birds, and he had a kind of monkey called a langur, which is actually a large-sized monkey, which he had kind of got used to him and was like his assistant, would sit next to him. But being an animal, sometimes was a little bit uncontrolled and would move around the monastery, and if he didn't like someone, he'd growl at them. But he liked the Western monks because we have more body hair than the Thai monks. So this pet monkey or langur, which was quite fierce, had very sharp teeth, and it was a very powerful, quite large animal. It would pick monks that it liked and monks it didn't like. So it liked the Western monks like myself, and he'd come and play with your body hair, like on your arm. He'd groom you, looking for bugs or whatever on you as an act of friendship. So he made friends with certain monks, and you're walking along, he'd come up to you and he'd want you to carry him. So you had to carry him on your arm as you're going to haul water, or as you're walking into the village to collect alms, he'd go with you. So he's a bit mischievous, but most of the time quite friendly, and Luang Por Thui trained him as best as he could. But eventually the monkey lost his temper with a visiting monk and bit him and drew blood. So after that they had to take him off to the national park. That was the end of him. But Luang Por Thui, very friendly to the animals, very compassionate, and obviously to people. He spent a lot of time putting funds into developing his local village. He built them a huge reservoir so they had a good source of water, because it's a very dry area, and other things to help the villagers. He would do a lot of development work for the local community. And he said, we don't need the money in the monastery. Like, he built one meditation hall and then the huts for the monks and nothing much else. There's a kitchen, some accommodation for laity, but very simple monastery, very simple buildings. So he's never wanted to raise funds to build big things and put money into the physical side of the monastery. So he put a lot of money into development work for the poor areas around the monastery. And he's famous for giving a talk once where he said, you really don't need to bring money to this monastery, just use your money to look after your parents. That would be the most useful thing for you to do with your money. You don't need to look after the monks. We don't have electricity bills to pay. We have enough food. We're good enough. And that talk he gave was reported all over Thailand, and people found it very reassuring and inspiring. And he's always been like that. He's a monk who's very committed to the practice of Dhamma Vinaya, developing meditation, developing the practice of mindfulness in daily life, and the mindfulness practice to develop samadhi, to develop insight, to let go of greed, anger and delusion. And he just hammers that over and over again in his talks. And he's always been respected as of very high integrity. So other monasteries, sometimes they invite him to go and help oversee their monastery, their accounts, and the way the monasteries are run, because he's very good at it and he's trusted, giving good advice, good experience. When he came to our monastery, we were brand new. We just had land and very few facilities, but he was very encouraging, and he said, well, this monastery is a great resource for the future. You're preserving the forest, so carry on doing that. He was very happy to see so many trees, and he said, just keep looking after the forest, which is what we intend to do. So he was very happy with that. And when he came here, he kept up his tradition of going alms round every day. So in those days, it was just a gravel track coming into the monastery, and it was very stony, spiky stones from the quarry. So we would follow him out on alms round every day out of the monastery, trying to be patient with the pain in our bare feet as we walked along this gravel. And he would go, and we went down to one or two of the local houses, receive food, come back. He was very keen for us to keep up the traditions of Bindabata and what we call a Charyawat, attending to senior monks, looking after their needs, washing the robes, using our alms bowls properly, the normal lifestyle of the forest monk. He was always encouraging monks to keep up those traditions, because it's very easy in this modern age to let them go. And he discouraged monks from spending a lot of time on the internet, social media and so on. He said the purpose of a monk's life is to train yourself in mindfulness, meditation and develop insight into the three characteristics. And so to minimize distractions and keep your life simple so that you can keep practicing. That's what he encouraged in his monastery and in the monasteries he visited. He even learned a bit of English. So in his monastery he had a couple of parrots that sort of hung around the main area, and the monks would feed them a bit. So he called these parrots blabbermouth, because whenever they were around they always make parrot sounds. They'd chat to each other, making loud squawking sounds. So he called them blabbermouth, using the English word. And he said, you see, when you're not mindful, it's just a lot of squawking noises, meaningless chatter, blabbermouth. And whenever they were around, he'd just say, see, blabbermouth is here, as a kind of indirect reflection on people who are not mindful of their speech, perhaps. And he learned various phrases like, you'd say nowadays everybody is addicted to their comfort and convenience, but then their minds become lazy and they don't have much patience or endurance to deal with suffering and understand suffering. So people are very weak-minded. So he said they're convenient but not clever. He would say that. Not just, we shouldn't just go for convenience all the time. If it's going to ruin our mind and make us very weak-minded, sometimes we should choose and maybe not always go the way of comfort and convenience. Once in a while, people would bring a newspaper to his monastery so he could find out news, because in those days there was no other way to know what was going on in the country. So they'd bring a newspaper, but then he'd complain, well, these newspapers, Thai newspapers, are always full of pictures of scantily clad women, like from scandals or celebrities and things, and pictures of various things that he thought were inappropriate. So one day I found him sitting there with a newspaper someone had brought him. He's cutting out all the pictures of females. He said, if the monks see these, it's going to ruin their meditation. We don't need this. So he cut out all the pictures. Another time he just read a little bit of the newspaper and then set fire to it on the concrete floor of the eating hall. Made a little pile of paper and just set fire to this. And he said, nobody needs to see this. It's just rubbish. So he'd do things like that, and he didn't like too many people visiting the monastery, disturbing the peace and the quiet and the meditative atmosphere. So sometimes you get these big tour groups coming from Bangkok going to see different teachers, and they come in big tour buses, like one bus, 60 people. Sometimes you get 3 or 4 buses together, so you get a few hundred people turning up at the monastery. So he built a beam across the monastery gate so tour buses couldn't fit in. They could still come and park outside, and they'd have to walk into the forest. So he thought that might reduce the numbers a bit. So he'd walk under this beam as we go out on alms round. Sometimes he'd turn to somebody like me, and he'd sort of have a joke. He'd say, "See this beam? The tour buses can't get into the monastery," and he'd have a good chuckle about that. He liked to laugh about these things, his methods of keeping the world at bay and keeping the monks restrained, living simply. He'd have a good laugh. Can I think of any more? One time somebody came and offered him a family-sized bar of Cadbury's dark chocolate, which is something we're allowed to eat in the afternoon. And we were finishing the chores one day. You clean up the hall, we haul water. Quite a lot of exercise involved in that. And then you're hot and sweaty, so you go off for a bath and then do your meditation. But before I went off, he called me over. And he looked around to make sure no one was looking, and he said, Dan. He called me Tan Dan. Dan was my lay name. So he called me, Dan, come here. And he whipped out this family-sized bar of Cadbury's chocolate from under his robe. It's like he was hiding it. He said, "Quick, you take this. I want you to have it, because I know you practice hard, and you can go off and use this to meditate, get some energy for your meditation. If I give it to these other monks, they're just lazy. They're just going to sit around talking and eating it. It's no good at all. So you take it, and don't show it to anyone, and don't give it to anyone." He shooed me away. He actually had some very good monks there who meditated very hard and were getting good results in their practice. But I think it was just his way of, he was pretty hard on his own monks, but he was also wanting to support me as a visitor from overseas. So it was quite nice to get a bit of praise when he said you practice hard, and get a bit of support, getting some dark chocolate treat. So he had that side to him as well. He had a sense of humour. He had kindness, but he could also be very tough when he needed to, and he'd quite often be critical of monks when they were unmindful, talking too much, when they dropped things, sloppy, rising late. You'd hear him say, "Oh, these monks are too lazy," if someone was getting up late and arriving late for some activity. One time there was a monk who wanted to leave the monastery And when you're a young monk, you take dependence on the teacher for 5 years. So you stay with under your teacher's guidance for 5 years. That's the Vinaya from the time of the Buddha. And we still practice that today, but sometimes people become impatient. They just want to leave, go off on their own, go to another monastery, or just go wandering. So there's one monk who wanted to do that. He'd only been a monk for a year. And whatever Luang Por Tui said to him, he wasn't going to change. He was so stubborn. He said, I am leaving, I'm not listening. And so Luang Por Tui would just say, oh, you're just so stubborn. You're always bashing your head against the wall, which is a sort of a phrase in Thai, hua chon fa. So he actually got his own head and started knocking it against the wall gently, not hurting himself, just to kind of show everyone what this monk was doing mentally in his stubbornness. So he said, your mind is like this, and he banged his head against the wall a few times. This is what you're like. But he was well respected throughout Thailand, and he's always had a lot of respect from the Thai army. So 1 year after he came back from visiting our monastery here, he had the head of the Thai army, the leading general, retired, and then said, I want to use my free time to become a monk. So he came to train with Luang Por Tui. So this is a man in his 60s, the top general of the Thai army, Kun Suriyut, came to stay with him and then ordained for a Vasa. And at first, all his, his officers and staff wanted to accompany him to support him in his ordination and wash his bowl for him and look after him. And he dismissed them all. He said, no, I'm going to live like a forest monk, because this is how Luang Por Tui teaches. He has to wash his own bowl, wash his own robes, sweep the paths, do everything like everyone else. So he received a lot of praise for that. He lived very humbly for about 4 months in the monastery, just like any other monk. And Luang Por Tui taught him very well, taught him to be humble. He said, you come into the monastery and become a monk, you set aside your worldly success, your achievements in the world, you set them at the monastery gate, you don't bring them in. So you're just an ordinary monk at the end of the line, letting go of your conceit, your pride, your ego and all of that. And he taught him very well, and he was very happy then and had good meditation experiences. Not long after that, there'd been a coup in Thailand, and they were looking around for some reliable person to be Prime Minister. So everyone thought, oh, he's been trained by Luang Por Tui, he's a man of integrity, honesty. So when he left the robes, not long after that, they made him Prime Minister for a year. And a lot of that was due to the training he'd received and the kind of guarantee from Luang Por Tui. So he's had many army officers and people from the army ordained there over the years. Which anyone who's lived with Luang Por Tui won't be surprised by, because he definitely is like a kind of has a slight military style to his demeanor, as well as these other attributes. But mainly, he's a very wise, peaceful monk with many stories, more than I can tell here, of his time as a monk and teachings, but always teaching people to base their practice on the practice of sila. Keep the precepts with integrity, whether you're a layperson or a sangha. Don't break your vinaya, don't break the 5 precepts. If you can keep the 5 precepts and then you develop meditation, mindfulness, then you've got a chance to see the Dhamma and liberate yourself from suffering. If you're not willing to keep the precepts, develop mindfulness, samadhi, and train yourself in insight, you'd say, you've got no chance to do it. You've got to practice, and you've got to give up to the practice. So I remember when he was here, somebody started asking him about 4th jhana. He said, Luang Por, when we attain 4th jhana, is it necessary to have 4th jhana to become an arahant? And he just cut the man off and said, look, you can talk about 4th jhana from the books, but looking at you, you probably can't stay with your meditation object for more than 10 seconds. So let's not talk about jhana yet. Let's just work on meditating on the breath or reciting the word Buddho until you can just keep your mind on that one object, and then we can discuss jhana. So he's very direct, down to earth, doesn't like to talk too much about unnecessary things. He'd always bring people back to practicing, developing awareness in the present moment, practicing the precepts, developing compassion for other beings, let go of your anger, let go of your greed. He's really good on letting go of greed and desire. Sometimes he'd talk about the world with me on Bindabar. You go down the road and talk about the corruption in the government and how things need to be fixed up, which is perhaps one reason why his student, the army officer, was brought in to be Prime Minister for a year. One time they put up a huge poster on the side of the dirt road going into the village because it was election time. There's a huge poster of one candidate to become the local MP, and the way they do it, they always glamorize the candidate. They've got their best kind of uniform and look on, and it's a massive poster promising all these things for everybody. And he looked at me with a sort of a sly look, and he said, "Do you know what a yaka is?" And I said, "Yeah, I know what a yaka is." He said, "Do you believe in yakas?" I said, "Yeah, I believe in yakas." A yaka is a kind of a being in the lower heaven realm. He's a kind of a giant, and often known for their extreme mood swings, from strong greed to strong anger. And there's a saying, you never annoy a yaka because they'll squash you. A bit like European fairy tales where you have a giant with a big club who squashes you, anyone who's angry with. Yakas are a bit like that. So he said, "Do you know what a yaka is?" I said, "Yeah, Luang Por, I know what a yaka is." And he just said, looking at the big poster, this massive poster by the side of the road, he just pointed to it and he just said, "Yaka," and chuckled and walked on. So he'd have a sense of humour and bring it in to different discussions. Great respect for his teachers, Luang Por Khao, Luang Ta Mahabua, Luang Por Man, and by all accounts, he's an enlightened meditation master who's dedicated his life to the practice of the Dhamma. Still alive, so if you get to Thailand, you can go and visit him. He's still around, and possibly not for that much longer. So if you're ever in Thailand, then go and pay respects. So a long time on the first question, understandably, because he's a teacher dear to us. Second question. Ajahn Chah frequently advised us to reflect on not sure with regards to all phenomena. Is there a time when one is sure? Well, I guess you could say the arahant is above not sure and sure. Their mind is purified from greed, anger, delusion, all wrong views. So they sometimes say the mind of the arahant is sure, it's certain, because they have no more delusion. They're no longer deluded by the world, and they're no longer tempted by the kilesas to fall into states of greed, desire, anger, fear. But Luang Por Chah used to say, you just, it doesn't matter where you're at in your practice. You're a beginner, or you've been practicing a while, or maybe you think you're an arahant. It's just keep reflecting. It's not sure. Whatever experiences you have in the practice, whatever the mental phenomena you're experiencing, whatever the physical phenomena you're experiencing, they're not sure in the sense they're impermanent. What's impermanent cannot be taken as a lasting, fixed, permanent self. And they run together, these two insights. Insight into impermanence is an insight into suffering, is an insight into not self. So Luang Por Chah just said, just keep developing, it's like developing right view from day one in your practice as a Buddhist, following the Buddhist path. Reflect on the impermanence of your body, feelings, thoughts, perceptions, sense consciousness. They're not sure, they change, they're conditioned things, and as the conditions change, those experiences change. So wherever you look in this world, internally, externally, you'll find this not sure reflection works. So you're feeling happy, you have some nice happy thoughts where it's not sure. Something changes in your experience and the thoughts change, the mood changes to something fearful or unhappy or sad or angry. It's not sure. You meet someone and you're enjoying their company and it's all going well, and then they say something or do something and it all changes, doesn't it? It's not sure. The first thing you learn coming to Melbourne, or the first thing I learned in Melbourne is, 4 seasons in one day. The weather is not sure. It's nice sunny and then suddenly it's wet and windy. It's not sure. The economy is not sure. People are not sure. Your health is not sure. One day it's going well, next day you fall ill. You're ill and then you get better. It's not sure. You like something and then you don't like it. You don't like something and then you acquire a taste for it and you do like it. It's not sure. Memory is not sure. One day your memory is clear and you remember everything very well and clearly, and then later on you've forgotten things. It's fuzzy. It's not sure. Feelings is not sure. Feelings in the body. You sit down on the ground, beginning of this talk, and you feel comfortable and at ease, pleasant. After sitting for a while, you start wriggling around. It's not sure. So Ajahn Chah encouraged us to use this reflection as insight, in developing vipassana insight all the time into the observing the changing nature, or the changeable nature of physical and mental phenomena, as a way to bring our mind in line with truth, the truth of the way things are. So he said, even if you think you're enlightened, okay, you may be enlightened, but it's not sure. If you keep this little reflection on the uncertainty of your experience there, it's like, he said, it's a safety valve from your mind falling into a fixed view on something which may be coming from ignorance, delusion. It may be wrong. You may have wrong information or wrong understanding. But if you keep that not sure aspect of your reflective power there, even if it is sure, it's true, what's happened is true, it's there, but you keep that sense of it's not sure, then you're on safe ground. Because once we commit absolutely to a viewpoint or a belief in something, you may be caught out because it may change. You may be deluded, it may be coming from ignorance. So even your sense of self that comes up with your spiritual attainment, you think you're a sotapanna, you think you're an arahant, okay, maybe you are. But if you keep the reflection it's not sure, then it keeps you alert, heedful, careful, so you don't fall into a delusion of self. And it's possible right up until enlightenment, there can always be some wrong delusion about one's practice, what one's attained. States of samadhi can be mistaken for nibbana, and so on. So from the very first step on the path right up to the very refined level of the mind, letting go of conceit and ignorance just before nibbana, the reflection on uncertainty, not sure, can be helpful. It's a helpful aid that keeps you sane, keeps you grounded at every level of the practice. So if you get into that habit of checking things, every thought, every belief, view you hold, opinion you hold, every experience you come in contact with, observe it. How certain is it? Is it certain? Is it sure or not? Not long, and sure enough, it changes. Your experience can change. So it's just a useful tool to give us some deeper insight into our experience of the world. So it's like a good friend that you can turn to when you're not sure. You turn to the reflection, it's not sure. Maybe, maybe not. Going on, question, are our 5 aggregates necessary for the appreciation of anicca and anatta? Can mundane self exist so long as we don't cling to it? That's what I wanted to know. Well, of course, the Buddhist teachings are full of these 2 levels of truth. It's what we call samutisacca, the conventional reality or assumed reality that allows us to communicate and function in society and in the world with other people. We use language all the time, which is what we call conventional reality, and language can change, it can evolve, and new words come in, old words go out. We can have misunderstandings because sometimes language, one person's use of language is different from the other. So conventional reality is like that. It's a useful tool for getting things done in the world, for learning, for communication, for expressing our feelings and our desires and our wants. But there's a certain limitation there because it's coming from one person to another, or it's an agreement, but then people's understanding of that agreement may vary. So conventional reality is like that, and this idea of me being a self, a person with a name and a personal history and a personal ID and my thoughts, my feelings, this is all what we call a conventional reality. And it's useful, but it's a little unreliable the more you investigate it, isn't it? You realise my view of myself is different from another's. The labels we put on things vary between people. But then there's the deeper reality, the deeper level of truth, what we call paramattha-sacca, which is just physical form in 4 elements, earth, air, fire and water, or solidity, liquidity, extension, and so on, heat, temperature, without any additional labels. There's just that basic physical part of the world, whether it's a building or a tree or a person, it's just building blocks of earth, air, fire and water. And then there's the mind, and the deeper, profound or ultimate truth of the mind, which is just there is a mind, consciousness that knows, feeling, perception arises with the mind, sense consciousness and thought formations, but there's no self in any of that. And that's obviously a very deep and profound truth to unravel for us. It's only when the mind is very, very mindful and still and quiet and observing that we can see through the normal conventional reality of language and concepts and ideas to the ultimate reality of just the basic building blocks of nature and the basic functions of nature. A mind that knows is just a function of nature. In the highest level, there's no owner to that mind. It's just a quality of knowing. But the conventional reality is that we create a name, a person out of our experience. So the body, the mind becomes an experience. So these 5 khandhas, the Buddha called them upadana khandha. They're a basis for clinging. When we're not clear, we're coming from a place of ignorance, misunderstanding of the truth, where we cling to the khandhas as me, mine, myself, a being, a person. But that's manufactured from our own mind, except we don't realize it. We just take it for granted. Other people do, so we reinforce each other. So you're a boy, a girl when you're born, you're a man, a woman, you're from this nationality, this cultural background, from this area, you've got these preferences in your character, your personality, you like this, you don't like that. All of this is the assumed reality of a self that gradually takes on a personality through life. We have friends and enemies and conflicts. All of this is what we call this assumed reality of the mind through ignorance clinging to the khandhas. So we cling to Vedana khandha, the feeling khandha, right? We like pleasure, so we seek pleasure and try to hold on to it. We dislike pain. But pleasure and pain are just feelings. So tonight we chanted the Eightfold Noble Path. The section on sati, satipatthana, is knowing feeling as feeling. Feeling is not a self, it's not a person, a being, me or you, us or them. It's just feeling. So the mind that is trained in the Eightfold Noble Path, purified by sila, developed sati, samadhi, and then insight, panyas, sees feeling as just feeling, without adding a self to it. But when there's not enough sati and panya, and the Eightfold Path is not fully developed, well, we take feeling as self. We cling to feeling as we cling to body, as we cling to mental formations, thoughts. So for the Arahant, the khandhas are just khandhas, and the mind is so trained and purified in its view, it doesn't make the mistake of creating a self out of the khandhas. Doesn't mean to say an Arahant no longer can speak about a person with a name and as a self. They understand that level of truth, of course. They can call you by a name, call themselves by a name, they can feel things and they know pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, and so on. They know the conventional reality, but the mind is no longer grasping at the khandhas as self. So Ajahn Chah said, the khandhas are just like part of the world, but the mind is no longer interested in them or giving importance to them or taking them up as self, taking ownership of them. But they're still aware of them. Still, as long as the one who's reached Nibbana is alive, they still have khandhas, and so they still feel pain, still feel pleasure, but there's no attachment, no clinging. So the khandhas just become khandhas, no longer upadana khandha. So Ajahn Chah used the metaphor of oil and water in a bottle. So oil and water can be in the same bottle, but they're not mixing because of their different thickness, viscosity. So mind of an Arahant is still in the world, but it's not mixing with the world. It's not caught up or lost in the world, and the world is the khandhas. But until we get to that point, we have to use our khandhas as a tool. So we still use this convention of me, a self. So I practice dana, generosity. I practice compassion. I meditate. I keep precepts. I'm training. I'm learning the Dhamma. You use that sense of I, but ultimately you're going beyond the sense of I. But until that point, you still use this sense of I. It's a useful convention. Otherwise, things get too difficult. Sometimes people try this to take out the word I, myself, from their speech. So you meet them, you say, "How are you doing?" And they say, "There is satisfaction in the mind at this moment." Or, "There is suffering arising in this moment." Ah, okay, so you have to sort of filter and work out what they're saying. It's a kind of code, because they're trying to speak without the word I, because they're letting go of the conventional sense of self. And you understand what they're doing, but it also gets very complicated and not convenient. And you see with governments and the world, they're always forcing you into a position of using this self, aren't they? You have your self, your name, your address, your ID. There's all these things that reinforce the sense of self in our culture. So, there's a lot to work with, and that is the practice, isn't it? Working through the conventional reality. You might say first you develop the good self and let go of the bad self, and then ultimately you let go of all self. Step-by-step process. Another question. When we use the breath as the object of our meditation practice, how can we hold to and maintain mindfulness when the breath eventually becomes subtle and fine? We'll keep doing it. That's the whole point. Keep mindful of the breath. As Luang Por Tui would say, 10 seconds is not enough. Your aim is to keep developing continuous mindfulness of the breath, of the movement, the in and out breath, but at one point, so you maybe tip of the nostrils, for example, keep paying attention there, and what you find is that the breath becomes more and more subtle as long as you're not distracted, falling asleep, thinking of all kinds of other things. So you're learning to let go of all that, bring your mind together in one place with the breath as an object. Your mind settles down, so you know where your mind is. It's not racing around thinking of many things, it's just with the breath. And the effect is that the breath becomes very subtle, pleasant, enjoyable, so you get feelings of rapture and joy. Body and mind become very light. So your 5 khandhas, when you're practicing this, become very light. The 5 khandhas, when there's a lot of dukkha, suffering, they feel heavy. You feel heavy mentally, physically when you're suffering. That's because of the clinging. But as you practice mindfulness of the breath, for instance, you're starting to loosen up that clinging, so you feel light, happy, but you're mindful. The important thing is to maintain the mindfulness, the constant awareness, paying attention, non-delusion, and not forgetting yourself. You keep mindful of the breath, keep remembering the breath, keep it in mind. And the physical experience of the breath becomes very subtle. The feeling of in and out breath becomes very subtle, very refined. Maybe gets to the point where it seems to stop. So you're just sitting there, you're with the mind that was with the breath, but now the breath, the physical manifestation of the breath is gone. Ajahn Chah said at that point, just take the knowledge that the breath is now gone from your awareness, the movement has gone, take that as your object. So you're still aware of the mind at that point, your mindfulness is maintained, but now the actual physical movement of the breath is gone. So people get worried or afraid at that point. They think, oh, no breath, will I die? Well, you'll find, as the medicine tells us, the science tells us, you still breathe through the pores of your skin. Your metabolism may slow down, even you have some physiological changes if your breath becomes that refined that you can't feel it anymore, the in and out movement. And you're sustaining mindfulness, well, physically, mentally, you feel very light, very bright, because your attention is turned inwards. You still have 5 khandhas, but at that moment your 5 khandhas are very light, they're in a good place. And so there's a very good opportunity now to reflect on the khandhas, because your mind is still, as long as you maintain mindfulness, and that requires continued effort. Not to get caught into the doubts, what shall I do next, what's happening, where's the breath gone? Not to get caught into fear, oh, there's no breath, what am I going to do? Am I going to die? Am I going to float away? All the things you normally identify with as self, these khandhas have gone really quiet and still, and the mind is separated from them. So, of course, at first it's a little bit unnerving or new, so you have to be careful not to lose your mindfulness or doubt. You also have to be aware that you can become dull at that point, because the mind is refined, there's less stimulation, there's a certain amount of pleasure. If you're not careful, the mind can go to sleep and become dull. So you have to maintain mindfulness not to do that. You have to maintain mindfulness not to get caught into doubt, worry about what's going on, this new experience of the peaceful mind. Maintain mindfulness, and then you're ready to contemplate in a very good way, because your mind is so still, it's not moving all over the place. You can look back at your body and see it as a collection of 4 elements, as something that is impermanent, not self. So you can investigate the sense of self-identity in your body and break through that. Same with feelings. The stronger your mindfulness, the more refined, continuous your mindfulness is, the more opportunity you have to see feeling as feeling and not just react. You may still have pain arise into your awareness, but you have enough mindfulness to contemplate pain as just a painful feeling, not me, not myself. So when you can maintain mindfulness with this stillness of what we call samadhi, and then contemplate the five khandhas, try and observe them and question, are these five khandhas really a self or not? And it's the answering of that question that releases your mind from delusions and wrong views. So plenty to work with. I wish you well with your meditation. If you get to that point, like Luang Por Tui would say, if you get to that point where your mind is very still, it's dropped its normal thinking, what we call the five hindrances have subsided, you're just with the knowing, the breath maybe has become very subtle or disappeared, you're very bright. Continue that as long as possible. Don't stop. If you've got an appointment or whatever, you just put it aside. Just carry on meditating. You say if he attained that before the meal, he might not eat that day. Didn't want to disturb that practice. He wanted to develop it as well as he could. Maybe in the lay life it's a bit harder because you've got more demands, more requirements of work, family and so on. But say you're on retreat or it's a weekend or something, if you're really peaceful in your meditation like that, just keep it going as long as possible, and you're deepening and strengthening your practice of mindfulness. And sometimes when you're ready, that's the correct thing to do. Just set aside all other business and just sit there as long as possible. If you're doing walking meditation, walk as long as possible and just forget everything else. Sooner or later you'll come out of that state and you'll start thinking again, and maybe you carry on doing your normal activities. But if you get really still and quiet in meditation, why not just keep it going? So most monks I know, meditation monks who've really got into their practice, they've had times when they just skipped a meal because they were deep in their samadhi, or they didn't go to bed. Right? Quite often one practice Luang Por Tui used to encourage you, and when you are attaining samadhi, is just stay up all night meditating. You know, if you're strong enough, you don't have any serious health issues, sometimes just go without sleep and meditate through the night. Sitting, walking, or just one posture, walking all night or sitting all night. When samadhi arises, you can do that. And if it does arise, well, why not take that opportunity to deepen your practice and learn a few things. So maybe that's enough for tonight. Talked for quite a while, it seems. So we'll leave it there, and we can always talk again next time.